Well, it is noon, and good afternoon, and welcome to another installment of the Washington County Community Foundation's partnership with the Washington County Bar Association in the Law School for Nonprofits series. I am Joanne Nazer, Manager of Nonprofit Leadership and Engagement at the Foundation. Thank you for joining us today to learn from our content expert about you don't have to form a nonprofit. Our presenter's bio and her photo are on the website, so I am so pleased to introduce Stacy Papa.
Hello, everybody. My name is Stacy Papa. I'm an attorney, and for the past 6 years, I've been the custody hearing officer for the Court of Common Pleas in Fayette County. But before that, I was the executive director of an educational nonprofit in Uniontown. And prior to that, I had been a grant writer since about 2002. And I worked for a law firm in Pittsburgh that handled nonprofit law as part of their practice. So I will say I don't have a private practice anymore, so I don't take private nonprofit clients, but people know my background and I tend to get a lot of inquiries, and I'm happy to answer sort of general questions and can make referrals if necessary. So my email is on the very last slide when we get to it here. And if you ever had something you wanted to follow up with me about, I'm happy to answer a quick question if I can, or hopefully point you in the right direction if possible. So see. So what I'm going to cover today, and this is something that I feel very strongly about and could talk about for hours and hours. So I'm going to try and keep an eye on the clock and get through all the material that I wanted to cover today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here and why we're even talking about this today, and why there's a need to have a little bit of a screening when someone has the idea that they want to start a new nonprofit, and what some of the alternatives are. I'm going to talk about why that's a challenge and what that means for the rest of the sector. I'm going to do what I call a nonprofit reality check, and then walk you through some things that you may not think about, or what this really looks like in practice when we have a lot of people starting new nonprofits. I'm going to talk about some things you might want to consider in the context of a needs assessment and deciding whether it really is appropriate to start a new nonprofit. Oh, wait, I see. I saw Kathy's message there.
I think, Lindsay, can you check and see if somebody needs to, has registered but not, or on maybe? Thank you.
And then in the last part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some alternatives to starting a new nonprofit, and including some newer ideas that are just starting in the sector, and some really interesting work that people are doing in that direction. So so like I said, I don't have a private practice anymore, but I do get a lot of people that refer people to me because they know that I used to do this kind of work. So I would say about once or twice a month, I still get this inquiry. Hey, I have this great idea for a new nonprofit. How do I get started? And the majority of questions I get fall in one of two categories. So the first one would be this, my slide here. I or someone I know want to start a new nonprofit. The second one is people who have run into problems now that they have a new nonprofit. Either there were some things overlooked in their formation and they now need to amend their articles of incorporation, or they've had their 501c status automatically revoked, and we'll talk about why that happens and what that means, or just they didn't know what they didn't know and ran into problems once they were up and running. So some terminology that I'm going to use in this presentation. So all 501c3s are nonprofits, with a little asterisk there, but not all nonprofits are 501c3s. Organizations are formed under state law, and they're almost always corporations. It's unusual. There are some exceptions where you can have an unincorporated association or a trust that can apply for 501c3 status, but for the most part, it's going to be a nonprofit corporation. In Pennsylvania, it would be formed under Pennsylvania law that then decides to apply for 501c3 nonprofit federal tax status. So you start at the state level, you form your entity, whatever it's going to be, and a nonprofit corporation is a specific type of entity under the Pennsylvania Business Corporation Law. And then you decide whether you want to get your 501c3 status. And that comes from the federal government. That's done through the IRS. You may also hear the term NGO. That's a non-governmental organization. That's used more commonly when you're talking about international organizations, larger organizations and work, because the idea of a nonprofit and a 501c3 is US based. And so the structures and the names can be different in other countries. So you may run into that NGO term, either people in the United States referring to themselves that way because they do international work, or because they're just at that larger scale where that's the more common designation. So in Pennsylvania, a nonprofit is governed by a board of directors, usually volunteer, and that's another topic that we could spend some time on, board governance. But if the organization has a head of the organization separate from the board leadership, so that would typically be an executive director, a CEO, or a president. That's usually once the organization is large enough that it makes sense to have a dedicated employee, either on a volunteer basis or as a paid employee, that's actually managing the organization. That person, and I still use executive director most of the time, but you will see the other terms used, and it's not incorrect to do that. But executive directors report to the board. I used to say when I was an executive director that I had 14 bosses, which was technically true. So you are hired by and fired by, if necessary, the board. And the typical structure is then the executive director is responsible for hiring and managing all other employees. And then another important concept is that no one really owns a nonprofit. So though you will hear people say my nonprofit, in reality, part of the trade-off for that preferential tax status is the idea that a nonprofit belongs to and is for the benefit of the public or a specific group of people with needs, and not owned by any one person. It is possible, depending on what state you're in and what the laws are, to have a nonprofit that has a single board member. I'm not a big fan of that structure, but it is permissible in some states, depending on how their laws are set up. So getting into what the problem is here and just sort of the scope of this, I want to give you a little bit of background on two major changes that happened in the nonprofit world in the 2000s and 2010s. So the first one was the Pension Protection Act of 2006, which made major changes to the requirements for annual filings for nonprofits. So nonprofits do file tax forms. They're called 990s. There's a bunch of different versions of the 990, and which ones you're obligated to file in general depends on how much income you have coming in. So there's like a 990, there's a 990 EZ, there's one for private foundations, which are a different 501c3 form. Oh, and let me pause for a second there and say, I'm generally going to focus on 501c3s in this presentation. There are a bunch of other 501c somethings. There's actually 29 different types. So C6s are business leagues, C7s are social and recreational clubs. And then there are slightly different, there's a 521, which is still in the same general concept as a farmers cooperative association. The tax benefits for each of these and who's eligible to form them change. But what I'm primarily talking about here is going to be 501c3s, and that's how most nonprofits that are working in the service sector are typically formed. So so let me backtrack for a second there. So prior to this Pension Protection Act taking effect, and it took effect in 2008, if you were a very small nonprofit, which at the time meant that you had less than $25,000 a year in gross receipts, you didn't have to file anything. So the problem with that is that the IRS didn't have any way to follow up with these organizations or to have a good count of who existed, who was still in operations, what they were doing. So there were organizations that were 50 years old that had not filed anything with the IRS in that entire 50 years. And when the IRS started sending notices out about these new rules that you would have to file something, they created this new form called the 990N, which stands for note card, because it's a very simple, I think it's 5 questions. They're mostly yes or no questions and maybe like your address. But when they started rolling out and made this new form mandatory, a lot of these older organizations had never updated their information with the IRS. So they were sending to addresses that didn't exist, to people that didn't exist anymore. And so a lot of people didn't even know that this was happening. And I can say locally, our attorneys here in Fayette County that do corporate work or corporate formations may handle a nonprofit formation once a year, once every few years as a favor, or as some pro bono work, and don't necessarily have a reason to or a means to stay up on top of changes. So I know that years after this took effect and organizations were starting to lose their nonprofit status, we still had local people saying, oh, you don't have to file anything if you're under a certain amount, and not realizing that those changes had taken place. So under this new rule, if you didn't file at least this 990N, the short form, for 3 years in a row, the IRS automatically revoked your 501c3 status. And this happened to a lot of organizations locally. And I think I have the numbers coming up here in a later slide, but it was pretty significant. It was, I want to say, in the 20,000 range statewide, and even a couple hundred in some of the small rural counties. And a lot of them didn't find out about this until they tried to apply for a grant or work with a larger organization for funding that said, hey, you don't actually have 501c3 status anymore. So, this was a big challenge for a lot of small organizations that then got caught up in the process of having to get their 501c3 status reinstated. And for a while, because the first ones really started to kick in around 2012, 2013, I was handling a lot of these locally on a regular basis, where people were getting these notices or finding out, like I said, from other organizations that they had been revoked. And then the other thing that I want to talk about that was a big change was prior to 2014, the way that you applied for 501c3 status was Form 1023, which is application for recognition of exemption. This would typically take a year and a half, sometimes 2 or 3 years, because the IRS had a processing backlog that ranged from 6 to 12 months, and that was just for the initial processing. They would often come back with further questions, request revisions, ask for additional documentation. So I know back in the early 2000s, when we were advising clients that wanted to form new nonprofits, we would typically tell them to expect 18 months to 2 years, start to finish, just to get a 501c3 approved. The filing fees ranged from $400 to $850, depending on what version of the form you were filing and how big the organization was. That's now been standardized to flat $600 for the full long form, and then $275 for the EZ. And it was a lengthy process. It was many pages long. I think I say that in here. Yeah, it was 12 pages of narrative questions, 8 required schedules. There were all these documents that you had to attach, like your articles of incorporation. And then in 2014, and this was really controversial, the IRS came out with the 1023 EZ, which is the short form for small organizations, meaning that you anticipated that you would have $50,000 or less per year in gross receipts for your first 3 years. This was a 3-page form that were mostly yes/no checkboxes. They didn't require any attachments. No documents had to be attached. As soon as they got caught up, these were processing in 3 to 4 weeks. We were seeing people get them back. LegalZoom offers a nonprofit formation. I looked just the other day out of curiosity that starts at $99 plus the filing fees. And there were a lot of concerns that this made it way too easy to start a new nonprofit. And in a second, we'll look at what this did for the numbers too. there were a lot of concerns when it first rolled out. The IRS made some changes in 2018 to try and address those concerns, but in reality, they were pretty minimal. So it's definitely still the state of things now that it is fairly simple to start up a new nonprofit. So why did this become a problem? So there was an audit by the National Taxpayer Advocate in 2015 that showed that 37% of these short form approvals were for organizations that didn't actually qualify for 501c3 status. And in some cases, very obviously, there were examples given of people that filed to start a 501c3 to help pay for like their grandparents' medical bills directly, and groups that were clearly outside what qualifies as a 501c3 in terms of not having a charitable purpose, things like that. And 8% of organizations didn't make the required changes to their documents, even after attesting to the IRS that they had done so. And then looking at sorry, I'm moving something on my screen so I can see it, but so going back to that idea of the automatic revocations, from 2010 to 2017, the IRS automatically revoked 760,000 organizations nationwide for failing to file their 990s for 3 years in a row. 60% of those were 501c3s. The largest chunk of those, it was 450,000 total, 275,000 501c3s were part of the first wave of revocations in 2010 and 2011. And I did look it up here. So it was 22,000 Pennsylvania 501c3s that had their status automatically revoked, and some of those have since been reinstated. And that included 123 organizations in the city of Washington, PA, and 51 in Uniontown, PA. So the database that you can use to look these up doesn't allow you to search by county, it's by zip code or town name. So that doesn't mean 123 organizations in Washington County. That's 123 organizations whose addresses were listed with Washington as their city. And to put that in perspective, the total number of 501c3s is about 1.8 million, of which about 1.3 million are 501c3s. So, losing 450,000 501c3s out of 1.3 million is a pretty significant chunk of organizations. And it wasn't necessarily for bad reasons. Like, a lot of organizations have come and gone over time and, had been defunct for years, and there was just really no mechanism for the IRS to keep up with that. And that's why they put this whole process in place. As far as the volume of new applications, so the last year that I could find numbers for, which was 2021, they handled 90,000 applications for 501c3 status in 2021. 75% of those were using the short form, and less than 1% of those applications, both the long form and the short form together, were denied. That there may have been some revisions in the process there, but ultimately only 1% were denied. And again, that's a big concern. So nonprofits are very easy to form, especially under these new rules. They're also very difficult to properly dissolve. And the Pennsylvania Department of State puts out sample forms for nonprofit formation, and that's what a lot of the services that you see, like LegalZoom and some of those other ones, use. And honestly, that's what a lot of attorneys who don't do a lot of this work use. They'll just go and pull the form from the Department of State. The problem is there's a couple of required provisions that if you're eventually going to want to apply for 501c3 status that have to be in your articles of incorporation. And if you don't include those originally, then you're going to have to amend your articles, which is another step in the process and costs additional money to fix that. And that's one of those questions that I get a lot. In fact, I just handled one of those in the last week from a local organization, and I pointed them towards some resources that they could use to do it on their own. But that's exactly what happened. A well-meaning attorney was doing some pro bono work for an organization that he supported, didn't know that there were additional changes that needed to be made to that form, so it was filed without those required provisions. So then when they went to apply for their 501c3, they didn't have the language that they needed in there, and then had to kind of backtrack and go through that amendment process. If you're trying to wrap up a nonprofit and close it, dissolve it correctly, you are required to get tax clearances from the state, and that can take a year or more. If you have assets over $100,000 in value, you're required to go through the orphans court. And I think very few people, in fact, I asked one of our orphans court judges the other day if he had ever had one of these. And I think he's been on the bench for 25, 26 years, and he said he hadn't. So, and didn't realize that it was a thing either that you needed to do. Because the reality is that a lot of these organizations just fade away. The bank accounts sit there, and then you end up years later realizing that none of the people are around who were signatories on the account, and there's no easy way to wrap it up, or assets that just kind of sit and aren't tied up in any meaningful way. Mergers offer similar challenges. Merging nonprofits is a difficult process too. It goes through the Attorney General's office, and there's a lot of additional steps, and there's not a lot of good information out there of exactly what you're obligated to do and how to do it. And then just recently, Pennsylvania started a new administrative dissolution process. The reporting is supposed to start this year. I think they're still working on the system that they're going to use for it. And it has a 3-year phase-in period. So they're anticipating the first dissolutions in 2028. I would not be surprised if that date gets pushed back based on the experience with the rollout of the 990 and how many organizations that caught up in this. And I did see that there's some concern that some attorneys and advisors are going to start recommending, if you want to wrap things up, we'll just do this let this dissolution process happen, because they're basically doing it for you. But the problem is the way this statute was written, the board of the organization is still going to have responsibility for any liabilities that remain after the administrative dissolution. So there's a big question here as to whether this is going to have the effect that anybody intended, or whether people could find out, 10 years later that they're on the hook for unpaid taxes from an organization that they used to be on the board of that was administratively dissolved. So another big problem is that there's a real lack of oversight over nonprofits. There are certain aspects that the Department of State Bureau of Charitable Organizations oversees, and then there is some federal oversight from the IRS. But in reality, when we were looking at those numbers of how many nonprofits exist right now, there is very little done in terms of audits and oversight. So until there is a problem, I don't think it really gets on anybody's radar. So here were some examples. Like, these were all recent examples that I pulled just doing a quick Google search of Pennsylvania nonprofits that had issues with fraud, embezzlement, and I've seen this. I've seen this at the local level, and it can be in small ways. A board is made up of friends and family, so there's no one really checking to see if that deduction is really a true business deduction, or if it's somebody pushing through personal expenses through a nonprofit, or hiring friends and relatives for positions. It has the same potential for abuse that any small business would have. Just because there's a board in place doesn't mean that the board necessarily understands what their obligations are and what they should be looking at. So this is just a little smattering of some of the loss of real dollars to the sector here through fraud and embezzlement. So yeah, some of these are bigger organizations with pretty significant numbers involved, but we had one locally where it wasn't a 501c3, it was a sports league, but someone embezzled like $15,000 from a youth sports league. So the opportunity is there if you have a bad actor that's willing to take it. So now I want to get into the reality check piece of this, because I think people, they are genuinely enthusiastic. They have an idea that they're really passionate about, that they want to start a new nonprofit. And the reality of that, once you get into it, is a little bit different. And I'm definitely speaking from experience here as a former nonprofit director and administrator, and I still stay active in some Facebook groups for executive directors, and we see a lot of the same complaints and the same frustrations over and over. So just like with a small business, nonprofits have a life cycle to them. And in general, they're started by someone or a group of people who are very passionate about a particular issue or something that they want to work on. But then the problem becomes, there may be a growth cycle where the organization becomes bigger, but times change, funding changes, passion changes, and people move on to other things, or, sometimes the problem is resolved that you were initially wanting to address, or the needs change there. And so there comes this point, and this is where this on the downslope here, where the line kind of breaks off, where you're past the peak, and you really have to decide as an organization, do we revamp, revisit, and sort of reinvent this organization, or do we wind things up? And like I said, some of these don't even go through this as a formal process. They just kind of drift off. And just like you'll see with for-profit businesses, where a person starts a new business that takes off, but then years later their children may or may not want to be involved, may not have the same passion and skill that the parent did. That happens here. The group that founded the organization, or the individual that founded it, may have a lot of interest and passion, but as it comes time to transition into subsequent board members, subsequent volunteers, that sort of thing, things fall off. So this is just representing that concept. Why do nonprofits get stuck or burn out? And again, there's some parallels here to the for-profit universe. So you have all of the challenges of running a for-profit business, plus the additional regulatory requirements and obligations that a nonprofit has. So it really is the worst of both worlds in that sense, because there are all these extra steps, and having to work under the structure of board governance while trying to get what is essentially a business up and off the ground. You'll hear a lot of talk about founders syndrome, and that's a little bit of what I was just saying, that the initial founder or founders are very passionate and feel very strongly. And you especially see this when if it's a single founder or two that are ready to step down and transition to an executive director or leader that was not one of the original founders. It can be very hard to make that transition. Does that original founder stay on the board? Do they still really want to be in charge and make the decisions without sitting in the driver's seat? This can be a big road bump here. The board governance structure, the way that it exists right now, is really challenging. We lack enough willing and able volunteers to serve on boards. Every board, that's probably, if I made a list of the third thing on the most common requests I get, is will you be on our board, or will you talk to our board about what they're supposed to be doing? Because there's a lot of resources out there, but you have to even know that it's something you would want to look for, and then they can be very state specific, or they can be very specific to a particular type of organization, like a health organization versus a legal focused organization, unique to the sector that they're working in. The other thing too is there's not a lot of good resources for new nonprofit managers, because what you'll find is you are very passionate about doing a particular kind of work and starting this nonprofit for a reason. But boy, nonprofit administration is the rise and grind of the day-to-day operations of a business. It's making sure payroll gets paid, the taxes get paid, all of those things. And it often takes people away from the kind of work that they wanted to do in the first place. So if you don't have that experience coming in the door, it can be a big challenge. And yeah, this last bullet point, the enthusiasm for your mission meets the day-to-day reality of managing an organization and what that looks like. The funding landscape has changed really dramatically. So I've been involved in grant writing and fundraising for about 20 years. And when I first started in 2002-ish, organizations would still develop the programs that they wanted to have and then try to get them funded. And you could write an inquiry letter, and maybe a foundation or someone would ask you for a fuller proposal as part of their process. And you could get a significant check back, for your program just based on that process. That has really shifted over the last 20 years in my experience. And I see more and more that organizations are having to develop new programs or change their existing programs in response to the funding that's available and to help it meet the requirements of what's out there, rather than assessing their own needs and coming up with what they feel is the most important. Though there's been a lot of work to dispel what we call in the sector the overhead myth, this idea that organizations should not spend money on overhead costs or shouldn't spend a lot of money on overhead costs. That starts to fall apart as soon as you really think about it, but it's still a very common misperception in the nonprofit world. I use the example, I worked for as an attorney for Chevron for a couple of years, and they required everybody to have I can't think of what the word is, but an assessment where ergonomics, were you sitting at your desk correctly? Were you using your mouse correctly? And if they found that your chair was too tall or too short, or you needed a footstool to rest your feet on, that was all provided for you. And I would say, thinking of Chevron, which I have strong feelings about, but they weren't doing that to make us happier employees. They were doing that because somewhere along the line, I'm sure someone had done a cost assessment to say it's easier to give you that fancy $50 mouse pad than to pay for the time off and the surgery involved when you get carpal tunnel syndrome or things like that. And we often expect nonprofits to work on a shoestring or with old donated equipment. And in the long run, that makes things a lot less efficient. You're spending a lot of time working around not having the things you need, the resources you need to do your job properly, because people feel like you should be struggling at all times to make it worth their donations. And I think we can look to the for-profit sector to say that that's not how they spend their money. If you go and buy an iPhone, you don't get to say to Apple, hey, I think you're spending too much money on marketing. We want to see you spend this on this category and this on this category. You just know that your phone costs X number of dollars and you can buy it for that price or not buy it for that price. But you'll also see a lot of executive directors talk about the nonprofit Hunger Games. And this comes from the idea that was really big when Facebook was first up and running, where everyone wanted to have these funding competitions where nonprofits, whoever would get the most votes would get the grant or the award or whatever. And people had, nonprofit leadership had a lot of issues with that approach to things, and if nothing else, we're not apples and oranges. You can't really compare this type of work that this organization is doing in this sector to this type of work that this organization is doing in a different sector. And also, it just became a popularity contest and nothing else. And it takes a lot of time to get involved in those kinds of things that didn't always pay off, and didn't really help to dispel any of the misconceptions about how things really work. So another trend is that funding is focusing more and more on short-term funding with unreasonable expectations of sustainability. I see this a lot with big state and federal grants. They want to fund a program for 2 or 3 years, and then they expect you to be able to continue that somehow. And, you're just getting things up and running. You're just getting staff into place. You're just starting to get some evaluations and some assessments back. And at that point, the grant is ending. And, I've had my frustrations with programs where that funder will fund new startups of the same program, but they won't continue to fund the existing program. So you'll see, organization A in a particular town had the grant for 3 years. They're not eligible to apply for 3 more years, but the next organization is, because to them, it's a new program. So then they get 3 years of funding. So then there's this constant shift of employees, of resources. There's not that retention and experience being built, because they want to see new things. And The other thing is the idea of sustainability isn't always realistic. There are some types of programs that are always going to require an external funding source. They're not fee-for-service programs where you can, pass the cost along to something or to someone in a way that's going to cover costs. The other big challenge, and I was discussing earlier that this was what eventually did in the organization that I was working for, were the cash flow challenges, where we had a pretty significant regular source of funding for our largest program, but that money was funded on an entirely reimbursement basis. So once a quarter, we would submit reports for the last quarter's expenses, and then we would have to wait 2 or 3 months to get that money in. And that caused significant problems in terms of cash flow to pay the payroll, because we had to front all of that money out and then hope that it came in. And boy, if you got caught in one of the delays with the state budget, I remember, not sure exactly what year it was. It would have been around that 2012, 2013, where we had the months of delay in the state budget. A lot of organizations just had to shut down during that period because there was just no money to keep payroll going and to keep the door open. And when they did get the budget passed, it took a long time to get the money flowing back into the system there. And if you don't have significant assets to borrow against, you're not going to necessarily be able to get a line of credit from a bank to help you cover those payroll and operating expenses. Evaluating and reporting requirements have gotten a lot more involved. And the expectation versus reality, I've seen executive directors complain about, a 10-page report for a $500 grant, and there definitely comes a point where it's just not worth your time. I would say to my board all the time, not all funding is good funding. Not all funding actually benefits the organization in the long run, because sometimes, whether it's reporting requirements, whether it's expectations or obligations that you may not have planned for, there are sometimes where it ends up costing the organization more than it benefits to do something like that. I'm involved with a project right now on a big state grant where the final reports, so the grant period ended last September, but the final reports have to be filed next November and December. But you cannot use grant funds to pay anybody to do that work next year. You had to have spent all of the grant funds before the end of last September. So, for an organization that may not have anything else going, or may not have the ability to bring someone in on the back end to do that, it's not very realistic, but that's the reality of the funding situation now. Everybody likes to talk about collaboration and with other organizations, but in reality, there's a lot of competition there too, and it can be very tense if you are going up against another local organization for the same funding, or that if you're being pitted against each other too, and sort of asked to bid up or to prove why you're better than the place up the street and should get this funding. There's also a big demand for evidence-based programs, but not a lot of evidence-based programs out there. So evidence-based programs just means that there's been some amount of research to study whether this particular program implemented in a particular way can produce a particular outcome. Keep myself moving here. So let me talk about, and I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail, and I purposely left this as a pretty random, unstructured list, but just a basic needs assessment. So if you're thinking about starting a new nonprofit, these are a lot of the questions that I think you need to be asking yourself and thinking through here. The first one being, what's your elevator pitch? Like, you have a minute, 2 minutes to explain to me, what is your organization going to do? What problem are you trying to solve? Like, sell it. If you think of like Shark Tank on TV, like, how are you going to convince me to volunteer, to donate, whatever that what you're doing is worth investing in some way? What problem are you trying to solve? How do you know there's a need? Because when people come and say, oh, I want to start this new nonprofit, and I start asking them, well, is anybody else doing this? And they're basing it entirely on their own experience and not any effort to research this and really look around to see if there are people doing it, and maybe you just haven't heard about it yet. How are you going to solve the problem? Who else is working on this problem? Why isn't anyone doing this yet if they're not? And sometimes there's a good reason for that, why there isn't somebody offering what you want to offer already. Has anybody tried this before? Were they successful or not? What challenges are you likely to face? What value are you bringing to the problem? So this is going to be very person specific. That person is like, I want to start a new nonprofit. So what are you going to be able to bring to this situation in terms of experience, education, passion for the subject that is going to be able to sustain this and really make it work? What are you going to need to get? What will you need to get started? What research and best practices exist for this problem? If you're talking about pretty much any sort of charitable work, there are white papers out there are studies out there are evidence-based programs out there that have addressed this. Why does this need to be a nonprofit? Is that the correct structure? And I'll talk more about that in a second too. What will your outputs and outcomes be? And this is a distinction that most people aren't aware of necessarily unless you do a lot of evaluation work. But so your output might be, if you're a hunger-based program, we served 10,000 meals this year. Your outcome, on the other hand, would be, how did you address the underlying problem? What did you achieve by doing that, not just the number? Because a lot of people focus on, well, we did X and we served this number of people, but not necessarily whether that's getting at the root problem or solving the problem that you need. How will you know you're successful? Another important question there too is, how will you know you're done? Because in theory, if you're trying to solve a particular problem or issue, there should be some endpoint, and you may never reach that endpoint, but what would that look like? How are you going to fund your work? What kinds of programs and services are you going to offer? How would you build the capacity you need for your plan? What laws and regulations apply to the work you want to do? And again, just because you have nonprofit status, that doesn't exclude you from having to follow licensure requirements for professionals, for OSHA requirements for your work office. That all still exists. The nonprofit doesn't get you out of any of those obligations. Can you attract enough resources to start and sustain the nonprofit? And do you have a business plan with a projected budget? So again, those are kind of all over the place intentionally, but just some of the things that I think you should be thinking about in terms of need assessment. So let me then get into some of the alternatives to starting a new nonprofit. One is to volunteer, which sounds simple, but isn't necessarily. And I include in here on behalf of all the EDs in the world, don't be surprised if that's not as easy as it sounds. So having the capacity to take on volunteers is a thing in and of itself, and not all organizations are necessarily set up to do that. And for example, if the organization does any work with children, then anybody that might have any contact with those children is required to have clearances. There's a risk to the organization of just taking in a volunteer that wants to help out and putting them into work in a program. Everybody gets those requirements or the questions, because I know a lot of our local schools encourage kids to do a volunteer project. Oh, well, my son needs X number of hours. Can he work for your organization? Again, if there's nobody to supervise that person, if there's no defined work for them to do, like it can take more work than the benefit of the nonprofit than the benefit the nonprofit receives to set the structures in place to handle volunteers. Consider working for an existing nonprofit. And again, if what you're interested is in doing the actual work, you may be better off in an employee role where you can actually focus on the direct services being provided than to be in an administrative role in running a new nonprofit. And just my personal plug here is 501c3 employees are eligible for PLSIF benefits. That's the public service loan forgiveness, student loan program. I've done a lot of paperwork for people over the years that were able to get their student loans forgiven through this program. It's 10 years of working for a nonprofit or governmental organization. It does not have to be 10 consecutive years, and it does not have to be 10 years with the same organization. But boy, if that kicks in for you, that can be a big bonus to doing some work for a nonprofit or a government organization. Consider becoming a board member of an existing nonprofit. People are always looking for qualified, willing, and able board members, and it can be a way to see a different side of nonprofit management and administration. You could raise funds for an existing program or organization, and I add preferably with their permission, because there's a lot of talk right now of people starting fundraisers, whether they're Facebook fundraisers or having a bake sale or doing whatever, but not coordinating with the organization themselves. And sometimes that money gets where it's going, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes an organization doesn't even realize that somebody's out there using their name as a way of selling something or raising money. But if you're seriously considering starting a nonprofit, then I think you should spend some time seriously trying to raise money for something similar before you get into it, because I think people imagine that once I have this 501c3 status, I can get grants and I can get donations. Right. And we're all trying to do the exact same thing there and fighting for, a limited amount of funding available in a small area. I really like giving circles. This was a thing for a while, and I would love to see it become more of a thing where small groups of people get together and pool their money and pick different organizations or programs to support, which I think is a great way to get involved locally and to be active with different organizations. There are donor advised funds, and these are available in different ways and at different levels, sometimes through community foundations. Some larger financial organizations have charitable arms that do this. And the general idea is that you can make a tax deductible gift to start a fund, and then that money can be used for other nonprofits and sort of pass through there. The requirements will vary. So I know each community foundation has very different requirements as to what they look for those and how they're used and how much control the donor maintains over how the funds are used. But you could say, like, say you lost a family member to a particular type of cancer and you wanted to support charities that do work on that particular cancer issue. If you had a significant, it's at a minimum, you're looking at a couple $1,000s, depending on the organization. It may be 50, it may be $100,000, but the idea being that you can then make that money, donate that money into the fund, and it can be paid out to different nonprofits that are working on those issues. So if that's something you're interested in, I would suggest that you reach out to either the local community foundations or look into whether a large financial services firm that you work with offers something like this. Another option would be starting an affiliate or a chapter of a larger organization. So the easiest way to think about this is if you think about how Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are structured, where there's sort of a national or a state organization and there can be local affiliates under it. They may have at the local level, a kit, it may not even need to be a formal organization structure, but like, here's how to get something like this up and running in your own community, all the way up to actually forming a formal organization that's an affiliate. So we see these structures all the time, and it's almost like franchising a new business. So part of the benefit of that is that you're getting something that's already existed and already been tested and already has a little bit of model to how it works. Another one is if you can find a nonprofit incubator, and I see these in some of the larger cities where there are spaces or organizations set up specifically to help mentor new nonprofits and to get them off the ground. So just like you see business incubators for for-profit businesses, there are nonprofit incubators out there too. And you don't necessarily have to be physically where the incubator is, depending on what type of work you do. And so that kind of leads me into fiscal sponsorship and how that works. Now, I pulled out an older book that I had that had, I think it was 6 different models for fiscal sponsorship. And I realized as I was looking through the book that a lot of those don't make sense anymore in light of the new short form process for forming a 501c3. A lot of these older fiscal sponsorship models existed because it was so difficult and so time consuming to get 501c3 status that you really had to almost piggyback on another organization as you were trying to get yourself up and running. And that's really not the case anymore. So a lot of those older structures don't make as much sense now, but there are some some structures that I do think make sense. And here I'm going to talk about the idea of an incubator in a little bit different way. It can be what I was just talking about, where there's sort of a base organization that serves as the home for new, smaller, existing organizations, but can also be working with an existing organization on a one-to-one basis to start up something that aligns with their mission and maybe eventually spin that off into something else. So that's one concept. Another one is using a management contract or a technical assistance kind of model, where your project, your organization has its own 501c3, but contracts with other providers or other organizations for support services. And this is something that I'm seeing more and more, where organizations will come together and maybe together outsource their payroll or outsource aspects of HR or something like that, or hire. There were a couple organizations in Pittsburgh a few years ago that jointly hired a CFO to handle high-level finances and shared the cost among the different organizations. So just like you may use a tax preparer for a small business, it often makes sense to outsource some amount of the ongoing management of the organization. The idea of shared resources is just what I was talking about there, that a single position or service might be purchased or shared by multiple organizations. One of these older concepts is the group exemption. This was typically how a lot of those affiliate organizations were set up. So the parent organization would have the 501c3, and there was a structure under which they could confer that status on the affiliates, the subordinate projects. These still exist, but in general, I think they're older organizations. I don't know a lot of people that are using this currently as a form for new organizations, but it is something that's out there. A direct project would be starting a new program entirely with an existing organization, and whether that stays under that organization or whether it eventually spins off into its own separate organization, but it's just kind of a way of getting things up and running. And then an independent contractor model is where a nonprofit would hire a for-profit business to provide certain services. And that's fairly common in the industry too. Got a couple more here, and I'm trying to watch my time because, again, I know I could keep talking forever. So as I was saying, the ease of obtaining the new 501 or the 501c3 designation with those new short forms has made a lot of those older ones obsolete. But also, if you're considering approaching another organization for something like this, expect some real negotiation and some hard questions from any legitimate organization that's willing to consider doing something like this. And you definitely want to have all of your terms and expectations put in writing. Here are some of the newer alternatives that I think are pretty interesting and exciting. And one of them is the growing idea of social enterprise. So this would be a for-profit business that has a social mission. And some of the ones that you might have heard of that are kind of set up this way are Tom's Shoes, Figs, which is kind of like the same thing, but for medical scrubs, Warby Parker, Better World Books. A lot of these are done on the model of you buy one of our products and we donate a second one of that same product to someone in need. Nonprofits can own for-profit businesses. That's a complicated setup. I don't think a lot of people realize that's a thing, but it can be done. A nonprofit could, for example, own a separate business that's a restaurant, and part of the mission of that restaurant may be that they hire people locally or hire people coming out of the prison system, something like that. If that's something you're interested in hearing more of, I can refer you to somebody that's been doing that kind of work in Western Pennsylvania, that kind of formation. You may also hear public benefit corporations and then B Corp certifications, which are two different things. So a benefit corporation, which we do have as an option in Pennsylvania, is a corporation that as part of its formation documents is for a public purpose, but it is still a for-profit corporation. And then B Corp certification is kind of a separate process that's not limited just to Pennsylvania. And it's it looks at, is the organization following ethical practices and a bunch of different operational aspects, that sort of thing. Mutual aid projects, I went down this rabbit hole and did some really interesting reading here, are sort of get away from the structure of building an organization and more focus on person-to-person support services. So this may be, again, in a group of people that are dealing with a similar disease issue, matching them with each other to help support them at different points in their journey. It can be a group that, if somebody in the group is in need of food or shelter or help with something, that the other members of the group step up and do that. The underlying concept here is solidarity, not charity, that it's not just about giving, but it's about having a mutual network of support around a particular issue or community. Community projects. So I just passed right across the street from the courthouse. We have one of those little free libraries, and there are a bunch of them around town that was started as a community project by a group here. So sometimes those sorts of one and done things can make a big difference without the need to start a whole nonprofit and do it under that sort of structure. And then this last one, this is not very attorney-like of me to say this, but if there are not a lot of costs, not a lot of expenses, not a lot of liability with the work that you're doing, and you're not particularly concerned about people being able to make tax-deductible donations, you may not need a formal structure. Unincorporated associations are a thing. Sometimes it doesn't even need that much structure. It can just be a group that decides to get together and take a particular action or work on a project that benefits the community, and may not even need the formality that goes along with some of these other structures. So I think if I'm looking at it, I can't believe it, but as fast as I talk, I did come in through the whole presentation in the time allocated there. So this is my email. I don't have my phone number on here because of, unfortunately, the work I do as a custody mediator. I try not to put my personal phone number out into the universe any more than I have to, but you are more than welcome to send me an email if you have any questions. And like I said, I don't take private clients. I'm not set up for that right now. But if you needed a referral or you were looking for somebody that does a certain type of work in the nonprofit world, I can absolutely refer you to some places and some shops that do that sort of thing. So I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have. I know I talked nonstop for a solid hour there.
And then we did get a question. Can you talk a
Yes.
little more about the unincorporated organizations?
So unincorporated organizations, and there are some places for this within state law. And I realize we have a mixed group here, right? So we have some people that are attorneys doing this, and then we have some people that are coming from the nonprofit side. So I'm going to try and make it not too overly technical one way or the other. As far as eligibility for grants. So most of the time, the people who are funding programs have their own requirements about what they can fund. And so I'm guessing too, with the community foundation, there are some structures, like if you're offering a scholarship, that's obviously going to be to a private person. But when you're funding an organization, a lot of times these unincorporated organizations are not necessary, unincorporated associations are not going to qualify for funding in terms of tax deductibility. So let me talk about an example. So my sister is a retired Pennsylvania State Police trooper, and they have a group that puts on like a golf tournament and a couple other things to fund. I'm trying to think exactly how it's set up. It helps support people in the community that need accessibility modifications made to their homes. Like, so someone was in an accident and they may need a ramp put on or something like that. That's sort of the projects that they end up funding. They are not formally incorporated. It's like there's a bank account somewhere that this money goes into. Everybody that's involved, like any sponsors and stuff they get for these golf tournaments, are aware that their donations are not tax deductible, but they like the work that this group is doing and they want to support that. So in that sense, you know, it really is just a loose group of people that have put together a specific project that they want to do, but they have run into that problem and had that discussion over the years. Does it make sense for them to go through the process of formally incorporating and applying for 501c3 status so that they can get those sort of tax deductible donations, especially like from larger companies and that sort of thing? And ultimately they've decided not to, that it isn't, yeah, they are leaving some money on the table by choosing not to do that, but at the scale they're working at and the amount of work that would be involved with maintaining that structure, it's just not worth that trade-off at this time. So you may see that again, like with the youth sports leagues, things like that. It just really comes down to, do you need that structure? Do you need that number, you know, that designation for something that you're doing? And a lot of it comes down to tax deductibility. So as a side note, that pension law that changed the rules about reporting, one of the major things that came in place there had to do with scholarships, and limiting somebody's ability to, so, you know, say I'm super wealthy, which I clearly am because I'm working here in the Fayette County courthouse. So obviously I'm well paid, and I have a child that's going to be going to college in 2 years. So I come to you at the community foundation and say, hey, I'd like to start this scholarship up, but I want the requirements for this scholarship to be, it has to be someone, a child, a female child in Fayette County whose last name is Papa. Those are the only ones who can qualify for this particular this scholarship. And so some of those restrictions were put in place for just that reason, as part of that same law, so that people couldn't use donor advised funds, scholarship organization, things like that, just as a way of passing through money to their own person, or, you know, to their own child. So those
But Stacy
restrictions.
too, oh, sorry to
No, no,
interrupt.
go ahead. Go ahead.
But what about if they find a fiscal sponsor for their organization, unincorporated organization?
Yes, so that could work. That's a possibility too. Although, like I said, expect some hard questions from any organization willing, because they're taking on liability to some extent there, you know.
Mhm.
They don't necessarily want to commit their existing staff and resources to managing this thing, but they also have a responsibility to make sure that the money's accounted for, that it's going where it's supposed to. So it definitely is possible to work with an existing nonprofit organization to start a particular project, but I would expect that to be a pretty intense discussion to anybody that's willing to take it on.
Thank you so much for your presentation on this important issue, and gave a lot of thought into this, and hopefully thought for all those participating to how best to use their time. The next session of our Nonprofit Leadership and Engagement Education Series will be on Tuesday, August 6th at noon, Creating and Utilizing Spreadsheets by Emmeline Ferguson, who's Washington County Community Foundation's Manager of Data and Technology Solutions. Information will be sent out in the next several weeks for registration. If there's no other questions, you have Stacy's email. You can also email the foundation at allocations@wccf.net. And just thanks again for this outstanding
Sure.
talk today, Stacy, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.